Hey everybody, welcome to another video episode of OK Talks. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in domestic US politics and also had the good fortune to have visited and lived in a number of countries besides my own, channeling those experiences. I do my best on this show to translate what's going on in my own country for my non-US listeners, and to help shed some light for the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So I mentioned in the last episode that I had originally planned on doing a sort of Normie Democrats strike back type episode about 2 weeks ago after a nationally watched primary election that I think was interesting and had an array of implications and things to address. But then that story got blown out of the water 2 days later with President Biden's suboptimal debate performance. And then, of course, the resulting freak out by Democratic insiders and even more so by media elites who never liked Biden in the first place. And then, of course, by the Supreme Court's absolutely inexcusable decision to basically legalize presidential crime. But I had already written an entire episode examining the backstory and the results of that primary election, and I will be damned if I'm going to waste it. Also, it is, actually a genuinely interesting story that I think remains very relevant to questions about the future of the Democratic Party, etc., especially as there is a similar primary to the one that I'm going to discuss in this episode coming up pretty soon in Missouri. Before I get into the main topic of this episode that I had been waiting to do for a couple of weeks, though, I do just want to quickly mention a couple of big developing international stories as sort of a heads up that A, they are happening, and B, they are something that I might try to do other episodes about. So the first is the absolute landslide victory achieved by the British Labour Party this past week after 14 years out of power. That victory actually contained a lot of dynamics that are very relevant to the primary that I'm going to be talking about in this episode. Second is the surprising/relieving results from the second round of the snap elections in France that President Macron had called after his party performed super poorly in the European elections, as I also discussed in an earlier episode of OK Talks, episode 69, I believe. In the first round of the elections in France, the French far-right party under Marine Le Pen performed very well, and there was a lot of worry that they would be able to take power in the French parliament. Instead, Macron's centrist coalition cooperated with the new far-left coalition under Jean-Luc Mélenchon to block the far-right from being able to take a majority, which had the good result of delivering a setback to Marine Le Pen, but the unfortunate side effect of empowering a certain far-left party in France that is also kind of scary for a number of reasons. Third, I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope it gets resolved some other way. I hope that I'm jumping the gun, but heads up to the very real possibility of a war starting in Lebanon in the near future. One of the many underreported stories out of the Middle East lately has been the reality that something around 100,000 Israeli civilians from the northern part of the country have been out of their homes and unable to return, basically since the war in Gaza began. That is because of Hezbollah, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a far more dangerous and well-equipped terrorist organization and proxy of the Islamic Republic regime in Iran than Hamas is. Hezbollah basically occupies the southern part of Lebanon in the same way that Hamas has occupied Gaza, and, well, at least similar. And because Hezbollah plays an outsized role in Lebanese politics, well, the government in Lebanon really just can't seem to get it under control. And for the last number of months, Hezbollah has been using that foothold they have there in southern Lebanon to launch rockets indiscriminately at Israeli civilians, resulting, again, in about 100,000 Israeli civilians being displaced. This, for my American listeners, in terms of population, is like if about 4 million Americans were forced out of their homes, which the US government would certainly not tolerate, nor should it. Israel has basically been tolerating this situation for the last 9 months because they've been in Gaza, they've been busy there, and they haven't wanted to get pulled into a two-front war. Don't think they're going to tolerate it very much longer. So don't be surprised if in the next little while Israel ends up going into southern Lebanon to disarm and push back Hezbollah so that they stop launching thousands of rockets at Israeli civilians. And also, don't be surprised if, unfortunately, a bunch of the coverage conveniently neglects to mention that thousands of rockets have been being launched at Israeli civilians by Hezbollah and instead frames the whole thing as though Israel just invaded Lebanon on a whim. At least that that is what the coverage of the war in Gaza so far would seem to indicate we're in for if this happens. So, with, as I say in the intro, a bit of light shed on those events of note going on in the rest of the world, I am going to pivot now back to the main topic of this episode as I planned it a few weeks back. Before I specifically talk about this primary election that happened a few weeks back in New York, there is a backstory that it will not shock longtime listeners to the show. I think is worth taking a couple of minutes to explore. So the Republican Party has been becoming consistently more and more crazy since Reagan, I would argue, although of course it has also to be said that Reagan himself would never fit in with the gang of lunatics that are now the elected descendants of his movement. There have been moments where that trend toward craziness and extremism has accelerated and decelerated, but one of the most sharp accelerations of that trend came in the 2010 midterm elections with the emergence of the Teabaggers, who changed their name to the Tea Party movement once somebody presumably told them the meaning of the verb to teabag. Now, I have often on this show advised anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about to Google it. This time, I very much advise that you, in fact, not do that. That being said, I am happy to respect the precedent of the original name the movement gave itself and will certainly continue to call them teabaggers as long as they keep insisting on doing their stupid little schoolyard taunt of referring to the Democratic Party as the Democrat Party. So, to the story here, refocusing. In 2010, there was a huge wave of far-right lunatics, many of whom were absolutely unqualified to serve in government, who suddenly found themselves in Congress. Now, I would argue that at least some of this can be explained by a racist backlash to the election of America's first non-white president. A lot of the energy with the teabaggers also seemed sort of a crystallization of anti-establishment sentiment that already existed, but was made substantially more powerful by the 2008 financial crash and resulting recession. Now, importantly, many of the teabaggers got to Congress, though, not by beating Democrats in the general election, but rather by running in primaries against more sane and experienced Republicans, beating them by running to their right, and then coasting through an easy general election in gerrymandered districts. Having a bunch of these people in Congress has not been good. I've done a number of earlier episodes where I talk about how the presence of unserious people who care more about their hatred of the other side and their ideological agenda than they do the survival of the US and liberal Western democracy more broadly, how that has led our political system basically to spending the last decade lurching from crisis to self-inflicted crisis. If anybody's curious, I focus in on these issues, especially in episodes 40 and 53 of OK Talks. So rather than go into massive amounts of detail right now about how badly and repeatedly teabagger Republicans have fucked over America and its government, I will just suggest that folks go listen to 40 or 53. Now, the thing is, as the Republicans have radicalized and elected all of these extremists to Congress, and it's only gotten worse, by the way, I should say, like the presence of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Beetlejuice Boebert, the Boebert Beetlejuice thing you maybe can Google, the presence of like certifiable lunatics like those make me long for the days when the craziest Republicans in Congress were, Louis Gohmert, who Bill Maher once described as, and I quote, like if Joe McCarthy were reincarnated and then dove into an empty pool. As the Republicans have sent crazier and crazier people to Congress, most of the rest of the country that isn't among the most like batshit far right 20% have increasingly asked, oh my God, what is wrong with them? Why can't they rein in their crazies? It's a very valid question. It deserves to be asked. Republicans deserve to have it asked of them and to be held accountable for the answer. The thing is, though, although I don't think that the Democratic Party has been moving to the left with anywhere near the same velocity with which Republicans have been moving to the right, the Democrats have undeniably moved left of late. One difference has been, though, that whereas among Republicans, a decent number of their crazies have found their way into elected office, like there are more than 40 members of the House Freedom Caucus, the successor to the Teabaggers, and I think those 40 are more extreme and borderline insane than the average Republican voter in America, although Lord knows at least some critical mass of those are also dangerously nuts. For Democrats, though, I would argue the shift left has much more been reflected in the sort of like online activist class than among actual elected officials or the actual base of the party, since, for the record, the base are the reliable voters who consistently show up, not the extremists who hold the entire coalition hostage to purity tests. It is important to point this out about the actual elected Democratic Party. Unlike a big number of Republicans currently holding office, the vast majority of elected Democrats are reasonable, qualified, pragmatic professionals who take their jobs seriously and are in the role primarily for the sake of making meaningful, tangible, positive change, as opposed to just making noise for the sake of generating a donor list and a social media following while sitting back and waiting for some sort of revolution. That is true of the vast majority of elected Democrats. The vast majority are totally solid. However, beginning a couple of years ago, we did start seeing from the far left some things that, if not the exact same, are at least analogous to some of the stuff that we've seen a ton of from the far right, starting with that teabagger revolution of 2010. We did, especially from about 2018 on, start seeing situations in which Democrats with long and impressive records of serious liberal achievements were losing their seats, not to Republicans, but rather to other Democrats who are almost invariably less qualified than the people they were running against, but who managed to catch them with their pants down by running left of them in a primary election wherein almost nobody voted. And then coast to victory in the safe district, go to Washington and use that safe seat primarily in a way that makes it a lot harder for the rest of the Democratic Party to build power or actually elect a majority with which we could get liberal priorities done. Oh, hey, speaking of getting things done, I forgot to say earlier, if you haven't already, please do be sure to subscribe to the show or follow the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Also, if you wouldn't mind hitting like and leaving a comment, I really would appreciate it. And most importantly, be sure to share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks to anybody who already has. Thanks in advance to anybody else who will. So back to what we were talking about. I'm not saying that I'm in principle opposed to primarying people. I'm certainly all for primarying out people that aren't very good at their jobs and are damaging the party or are like way out of the ideological mainstream of the Democratic Party or anything along those lines, as I'll get to in a second. But if you're a Democrat running against another Democrat who's doing a pretty good job and is actually pretty reflective of the sentiment of the district overall, if not the tiny number of hardcore partisan activists who usually show up to vote in a primary, if you get lucky and get to run for Congress in a safe district because you caught a good member of your own party off guard in a primary, well, you better do a really good job in Washington. You better make more than just noise when you get there. It might also be nice if you didn't actively and repeatedly make it harder for Democrats who aren't lucky enough to be running in a super safe district to get elected. All of which brings me to soon-to-be former Congressman Jamaal Bowman, the current representative of New York's 16th district. Bowman was a middle school principal before he was recruited in 2020 by an organization called Justice Democrats, which is a somewhat problematic organization for a number of reasons. But for now, I'll just say that they're basically the far left analog to Heritage Action or Tea Party Patriots or Freedom Works or any of the other organizations that have over the years funded far right nutcases in primaries to replace more potty trained Republicans. Okay, so Bowman was recruited by the Justice Democrats to run in a primary against Congressman Eliot Engel. Now, Representative Engel was one of the sort of boring, like low-profile workhorse types who was in Congress for ages, quietly moving the ball forward, good governance and on good governance and liberal priorities. His primary area of focus was in foreign policy, where he was, basically within the mainstream of the Democratic Party and the foreign policy establishment. Also, like other congresspeople who are mostly working in the foreign policy space, Congressman Engel did not tend to be like a super bomb thrower, but in terms of his voting record, he was on the left side of virtually every domestic policy issue. He just wasn't like performatively inflammatory about it. But he did not take the primary threat seriously enough until it was way too late and lost to Bowman, who then coasted through the general election. And what has Representative Bowman gotten done in Washington? Well, not a whole lot in terms of like tangible accomplishments. What he has done has been to make noise, figuratively and literally. I mean, the guy straight up pulled a fire alarm that forced hundreds of people to evacuate a House office building because he was trying to delay a vote. He also, on multiple occasions, heckled speakers on the floor of the House, which you're really not supposed to do. And when that wasn't enough, would apparently just kind of walk around the Capitol and like taunt Republicans and get into shouting matches with them in the hallways, which is awkward. Now, from what I understand, from the reporting around this, even before October 7th, which I'll get to in a minute, Congressman Bowman was already losing popularity in his district because he apparently was not doing much in the way of constituent services, which, although I have my own opinions about, is kind of a big part of the job of being a member of Congress. And then, yes, came the terrorist attacks of October 7th. And there are a number of boneheaded things Bowman has done in the wake of the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, but I'll just whittle it down to the gems. And I should just say here, all of what I'm about to say has been widely reported at different times and in different outlets, but kudos to liberal Washington Post columnist Dana Milbank, who boiled a lot of this down into his great op-ed that came out after Bowman's primary loss. Representative Bowman, after the Hamas attacks of October 7th, called the very much true and very widely confirmed reports of mass rape as part of the attack, quote, lies and propaganda. He called for a ceasefire like a week after the attack, before Israel had done almost anything to respond, which is to say, at a time that would have guaranteed that Hamas continued to hold power and could launch further attacks effectively unchecked. He's also dabbled in the usual anti-Israel slander of casually throwing around words like apartheid and genocide, which are as factually incorrect and slanderous as they are stupidly inflammatory. With Representative Bowman being one of the primary purveyors of anti-Israel propaganda in elected office, a bunch of pro-Israel groups quite understandably supported Bowman's primary challenger, George Latimer, a longtime fixture of progressive Democratic politics in Westchester County, which is a huge part of the 16th District. This, and I think a general feeling of the walls sort of starting to close in, caused Bowman to become increasingly a little crazy on the campaign trail, along with a bunch of his supporters who naturally cooked up stories of Latimer being a racist, nope, and being a Republican, also no. We also were treated to Bowman at rallies, at Bowman rallies, pardon me, to this flavor of, yeah, I don't know what to call it. I guess meltdown might be the right word, but check this out.
We are gonna show fucking AIPAC the power of the motherfucking South Bronx. People ask me why I got a foul mouth. What am I supposed to do? You coming after me. You coming after my family. You coming after my children. I'm not supposed to fight back. I'm not supposed to fight back. We're gonna show them who the fuck we are. Show them who the fuck we are! Bowman! Bowman!
Look, far be it from me to criticize anyone for swearing too fucking much, but that's, well, potential adjectives abound. Also, as far as I know, no one in any way went after Congressman Bowman's family, but you did hear in that clip something that crystallized the sort of primal scream of Congressman Bowman and his supporters as his campaign increasingly circled the drain. AIPAC. What is AIPAC, you ask? Well, AIPAC bills itself as a pro-Israel lobbying group, which just sucks. In a lot of ways, they just kind of suck. As far as I understand it, AIPAC has increasingly become not exactly pro-Israel broadly so much as pro-Likud specifically, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is the biggest right-wing political party in Israel, in Netanyahu's party. So Bowman called AIPAC racists and some other fairly colorful language, and although I am, as you can tell, not a huge fan of AIPAC, I'm also not aware that there's any more evidence of them being racist than there is of George Latimer being a racist, which is to say, none. But yeah, it has to be said, AIPAC did spend about $14 million on behalf of George Latimer in an effort to oust Jamaal Bowman. But what do you expect them to do? Not try to defeat a vulnerable incumbent who happens to be one of the most aggressively and, as I said, often straight up slanderously anti-Israel members of Congress? What else are they going to do? And also, there are plenty of vocally anti-Israel organizations that have openly supported Bowman and gave him money. So what's good for the goose and all that. Look, I'm not going to come out and say Congressman Bowman is anti-Semitic, as a number of others have done. I don't know what's in his heart. He's probably even a perfectly decent guy. But having the last months of his campaign devolve into a constant drumbeat of AIPAC, 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 AIPAC is buying the race, the pro-Israel lobby is brainwashing voters, does, for me, get uncomfortably close to playing into the Jewish money buying things off conspiracy trope. Also, when speaking about Westchester County, a big part of his district, Congressman Bowman told Politico, and I'm quoting here, Westchester is segregated. There are certain places where the Jews live and concentrate. I'm sure they made a decision to do that for their own reasons. That's not true, as far as I know. Kind of a weird thing to say, especially at a moment when your main calling card is as being super anti the world's only Jewish state, when a decent percentage of your district is Jewish. Yes, AIPAC played a significant role in making this the most expensive House primary election ever to date. But it is not why Congressman Bowman will not be going back to Washington. It is a convenient narrative for anti-Israel conspiracy theorists, but Bowman lost by almost 20 points. $14 million is a big old chunk of change, but that does not cause someone who otherwise would have won to lose by almost 20 points in one of the most high-profile primary races of the year. Also, Huffington Post and The Nation have reported that Latimer's campaign's internal polling already had him winning by at least 10 points well before AIPAC spent a single dime on this race. Bowman was going to lose anyway, because by all accounts, he was just not a very good congressman. And, when it came out that, it also came out that he was once like a 9/11 truther, which I'm guessing probably didn't play too well in New York. And also because, his first reaction to the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust was to deny central elements of the attack, and in doing so, whether intentionally or not, effectively run cover for the people who did it. This whole Bowman episode, unfortunately, necessitates that I yet again open a front in the little OK Talks war on the New York Times. I kid, of course. The New York Times is a great newspaper, even if they have apparently decided that right now they need to dedicate basically all their resources to a look what serious people we are campaign to try to deep six Joe Biden. Okay, right. But I'm referring to here to the fact that a couple of times in the last number of months, I've felt compelled on this show, episodes 56 and 64 specifically, if you're curious, both worth a listen to, if I do say so myself. I felt compelled to talk about some examples and the impacts of very sloppy coverage by the Times of stories having to do with the war in Gaza. Their reaction to Bowman's defeat seems to indicate that they have a bit of a problem when it comes to covering anything even like tangentially related to Israel. So I say this, the Times seems to have a bit of a problem that comes out sometimes when they're covering stuff related to Israel. Like now, the New York Times has earned its reputation as like maybe the most important news outlet in the history of humanity. Like it's often called the paper of record, no matter how many times Trump calls it the failing New York Times. What the Times says on its journalism side, that is to say, as separate from the opinion side, is taken almost as gospel. In my view, that position, that platform, not to mention the fact that the Times is just about the only print outlet to emerge not only unscathed but stronger as as the entire rest of the print media burns to the ground around it. All of that for me gives the Times a responsibility to not give in to the impulse to put out the clickbait or always try to be first, but rather to get things right before they run it. A responsibility that they have epically failed at when it comes to anything to do with Israel lately. I discuss that in more detail on episode 56, the collective media fuck up resulting from the rushed coverage around an explosion in a hospital in a Gaza parking lot, which took place at the very beginning of the war in Gaza, which was falsely reported in a whole bunch of outlets, but prominently the New York Times, as basically Israel bombs hospital, 500 dead. Over the next few hours, it started becoming clear that was maybe not true. But the Times did not issue a retraction of the initial headline, where they'd also shown a picture of a totally different building than the one in question. Rather, they just quietly changed around the headline on the website like 4 times over the next few hours. For the record, it turned out the next day that the hospital was basically fine. The explosion and resulting fire were not in the hospital. They were rather in the parking lot. Orders of magnitude fewer people had been killed than was originally reported. And it wasn't an Israeli strike at all that caused the explosion. It was a malfunctioning rocket that Palestinian Islamic Jihad had tried and failed to launch at Israel. But this, for lack of a better expression, shoot first, ask questions later thing that the Times did, it wasn't great. It wasn't great in terms of its impact on the war and the politics surrounding it, as I explore in those earlier episodes. And it wasn't great in terms of the Times' own credibility, which I would very much like to remain as intact as possible at a time when we desperately need to be able to count on responsible journalism. But why am I bringing this all up now, you might ask? Well, this game of step one, respond to breaking news with a super inflammatory headline and corresponding social media post designed to blame the Israelis for something. And then step two, remember you work on the news side of the paper and not the opinion side. And the way you frame this makes you look, super thirsty to take a shot at the Israelis. Also, it turns out the headline mischaracterized or didn't at all align with the facts. And then walk it back by editing the headline after the people who were happy to see it had already had a chance to screenshot it. This game got played again in the Times' response to the news that Jamaal Bowman had lost his primary election. Here's the first headline that they ran. Quote, Bowman falls in House primary overtaken by flood of pro-Israel money, unquote. Also, they made sure to use a picture of Bowman's opponent, George Latimer, that makes him look, well, a bunch of jokes come to mind which surely would offend somebody, so I'm just going to say it's not a very good picture of George Latimer. But again, as I mentioned before, Bowman was on track to lose by at least 10 points before pro-Israel groups spent a fucking cent in this race. Furthermore, if you do a little digging, the sort of thing that some top-of-the-line New York-based journalists might be in a good position to do, well, you'd find out that the vast majority of George Latimer's fundraising actually came from within the district that he was running to represent, as opposed to Bowman, the vast majority of whose fundraising came from elsewhere. Remember when I threw shade a little earlier at members of Congress whose prime directive seemed to be not to pass laws, but rather to make noise and generate a donor list? This is sort of what I was talking about. Not that there's anything wrong with fundraising outside of your own constituency, per se. I have certainly donated to candidates who are not my direct representative. But in light of the information that way more of Latimer's fundraising was in district than was the case with Congressman Bowman, does make it kind of strange that the first headline from the Times before they quietly changed it was basically hero congressman brought down by outsider money. Because, yeah, they did, after that initial headline, they did change it to something that did not mention the money aspect of it all. But yeah, same sort of weird game of here's headline number one. Actually, just kidding. But, there you go. Two ironclad reasons why that initial headline was stupid. And reveals yet again the New York Times' weirdly itchy trigger finger when it comes to any opportunity whatsoever to cast aspersions on the Israelis. Kind of weird. But look, the most important headline from the whole Bowman saga is this. Unlike Republicans, who seem perfectly happy to be represented by the worst, craziest, Star Wars bar scene characters that they can possibly find, Democratic voters, at least sometimes, will do the thing that we have been beseeching the Republicans to do since the teabagger revolution of 2010. Our voters will rein in some of our crazies. Now, to be fair, a lot of work remains to be done here. To wit, there is another primary that's set to happen in August, I believe, in which it's quite possible that Congresswoman Cori Bush is going to lose her seat too. Now, Bush is a representative very much in the vein of Congressman Bowman. That is to say, she got to Congress by attacking not Republicans, but rather other Democrats. She has repeatedly gotten into trouble for saying pretty blatantly anti-Semitic things, voted against a resolution that would have blocked Hamas members from entering the United States, has actively fundraised with a person who has repeatedly called for the violent destruction of Israel and the murder of its entire population. Yes, it's true. Google Naveen Ayesh if you don't believe me. Congresswoman Bush also is under active investigation by the Department of Justice for violations of campaign finance laws and has claimed to have cured tumors just by touching them. To be fair, Congresswoman Bush was a nurse. but I don't think that miracles are usually part of an RN degree. Now, before I wrap up, I want to just circle back to something that I brought up at the top of the episode, the massive landslide victory that was just achieved by the British Labour Party after 14 years, in the political wilderness. Again, this is something that I'm hoping to maybe do an entire episode on at some point, but I do want to mention here because it's a sort of direct parallel to what I'm talking about. So Labour was out of power for 14 years for a number of reasons. One of those reasons was certainly the fact that over the last decade or so, it started having a real anti-Semitism problem. I mean, this came in particular to a head when the Labour Party was under the control of Jeremy Corbyn, a fringe leftist, tanky, pro-Russian, pro-terrorist creep who is on the record specifically referring to Hamas and Hezbollah as friends. As unappealing as were a number of the conservative prime ministers over the last, decade or 14 years or so, particularly Boris Johnson, the British public were just never going to accept the idea of somebody like a Jeremy Corbyn being prime minister and, did not trust a party that would voluntarily be led by him. So then what happened? Well, in short, a couple of years back, Keir Starmer managed to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn and become the leader of the Labour Party, and then go on a ruthless purge of the sort of fringe and anti-Semitic elements of the party that had been festering there under Corbyn. And then last week there was the first general election in the UK in years, and Labour won the single biggest majority that it has achieved in decades. Let's not miss the obvious lesson to be learned from what just happened in the UK. Speaking as a person who is certainly from the left half of politics in the US, much more needs to happen to curb the worst inclinations or just jettison the fringe left. More needs to be done to make sure that the progressive movement is entirely focused on making progress and helping people, rather than the sorts of moral preening and purity tests that have at times sidetracked it of late. But the high-profile defeat of Congressman Jamaal Bowman and the potential defeat of Congresswoman Cori Bush, these are good steps. And they certainly should give pause to some friends of mine who, driven nuts by some of the excesses of the far left, has started telling me, oh, it's too late, Oliver, the Democratic Party is just lost. No, it is not. The vast majority of the Democratic Party is a group of pragmatic people focused on responsible governance and advancing liberal priorities to improve people's lives. To quote Dana Milbank in that Washington Post piece that I referenced earlier, Bowman will soon be gone, and good riddance. There will inevitably be more like him. The right has no monopoly on bullies and demagogues. But it's an encouraging sign that at a time when the country is losing its collective mind, there is still a critical mass on the left who can say, stop. That's it for this episode of OK Talks. If you like the show and want to make sure not to miss the next episode, hit subscribe or follow the channel. If you really want to do me a favor, please do be sure to hit like and leave a comment, and most importantly, share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks to anybody who has, thanks in advance to anyone who will, thanks to my friend Nate Wright for having designed the show's artwork, and to anyone else who is listening.